the actual discussion, but I would forget otherwise. So, um, all right. So, Fran, for those of you who don't know you already, um, can you just sort of introduce yourself to the group? And for those of you who don't know Fran, maybe you can do the same.
Sure. Well, I've been an energy climate person forever, and I was a consultant in energy policy stuff for some years. I worked at DOER as a policy director in the 90s when we were doing restructuring of the electric industry, which was a little crazy, but fun. And I worked at the um, Renewable Energy Trust in the 2000 to 2010 period, most of it, um, working on interconnection of distributed generation and things like that. So I've been playing around with these energy issues for a long time. I was involved with the Sierra Club Energy Committee for a little while, and then I I actually got mad at them because I didn't think they were radical enough. Um, they kept talking about meeting the net zero by 2050, and I kept freaking out like 20 what? So I'm very impatient. I have two grandsons, and I'm very impatient.
And yeah, I'm glad you were able to join us today. Um, I know Roy. Well, who else here does not have is not already, you know.
Well, I can segue because
Okay.
I'm on the Sierra Club Energy Committee for the Massachusetts chapter now. It's not really active. They sort of branched off into an energy justice group. That's
Yeah, it became an EJ thing.
yeah. Um, but there's still some work. They do try to follow what's happening in the legislature and they have lobby days to promote things and so on. Kind of like ECA does. So Paul Dale is still active in that. I don't know if you overlapped
I
with him.
remember Paul very well. Yes, yes.
And then I'm also an electrical engineer. So that's what I'm attracted to most in this business, the electricity side. I'm on the ICE New England Planning Advisory Committee, which is, all volunteer. If you just show up here on the committee. But there is a process to get vetted, and I went through that. Um, and attend those meetings monthly and as many of the other key technical committee meetings as I can, markets, transmission, and the PC.
Wow.
So
That's a big commitment right there.
it is. It's a lot of time.
We all owe you something, Roy.
Well, but make it based on my output, not on the time I spend on something, please. And then I was just at the MIT Energy Conference, the so-called showcase last night, where they had about 30 startups, each with a table explaining what they were doing. And like it was like 5 years ago, the people claiming to do, CO2 to methanol, very efficient process, or 100-hour energy storage, 60% round trip efficiency compared to 40% from other systems and so on. So hopefully they'll be able to deliver on their promises, but certainly not expecting something from all of them. But that's a bit of good news that there are still people working these problems despite what's happening at the federal level. But I'll turn it over to the next person.
I know I've met most of you, but Bob Hudson. I have no real background in energy at all. I'm a retired doctor and like I did a lot of sort of research in addition to clinical work and uh, infectious diseases. And I just thought I'd try to get involved in the energy climate area to try to help something get done. Um, and I feel like I'm learning a lot. It's still way behind everybody else here, I think, but it's been interesting starting to learn.
Um, I'm not an engineer. I'm not a scientist. I started life doing languages and then eventually went to law school and basically did law in the financial services sector, primarily his work. Here, what I am interested in and pursue most is natural solutions. I work a lot on tree stuff and water and things like that. And I serve as a touchstone for this group. So if I can understand it, there's a chance that the rest of the membership can understand it. So that's my role here often enough. But I learn a lot, and that's helpful and a good thing.
A little bit, and certainly on the ledge team meetings. Paul?
Well, I don't know. You know me, Fran.
Okay,
No?
all right.
Yeah.
So any other check-ins before we jump in? I know that I don't know. I think Ed is also on some vacation. He had asked 2 meetings ago for us to each send him a list of our 3 sort of areas that we are, passionate about and would like to pursue, that he would collate that list. I don't, if you haven't done that already, please forward your ideas of what you would like to pursue to Ed, and we'll review them when he returns from vacation, which I think he's on. Any other check-ins?
I thought he was around.
He may
But-
be. I know he's been sending emails, but
Yeah, and we have a natural solutions working group meeting later this afternoon, which I thought he was going to be at, so I don't know.
well, maybe he will show up. So,
Yeah.
are there any other check-ins before? So today we're gonna sort of start to dive into that area of the looking at the Clean Energy and Climate Plan, whether there is still any realistic hope for us to achieve the 2030 emissions limits. We talked about this a little bit at yesterday's leadership team meeting. I feel this is a kind of a sensitive topic, one that if depending on what conclusion we come to, I think we have to be careful about how we message it. And I wouldn't, I said at yesterday's leadership team meeting that we wouldn't, outside of this group, we wouldn't talk about what our thoughts are about meeting or not meeting the 2030 limits. I don't know. So that sort of background, and I think everybody in the leadership team sort of who was there yesterday agreed. And we're also trying to find out what the administration's view is currently. There's some sense that, some of the key people in the legislature and also in the administration, in particular, but apparently I'm hearing that there was a presentation by Hoffer a week or so ago, where she was I haven't seen it, where she was coming across as fairly pessimistic about the likelihood of the state achieving the 2030 limit. So I think we would want to, if the administration was already taking some sort of position there, we might want to follow their lead on how they're messaging it. All right. I did look into, I have been, following the development of the Clean Energy and Climate Plan going back to 2020, you know, when, or even before, but in 2020, when a draft of the Clean Energy and Climate Plan was produced, and then the so-called final one was released in 2022, along with a model that was used to demonstrate, you know, what would be required in order to achieve the 2025, 2030, and 2050 targets. So I've spent some time looking at that, and I thought maybe that's the way I put together a little paper. It's a very much of a draft at this point, but I thought we could look at that today and just discuss that. I didn't touch, Paul, I didn't touch on transportation because I thought that would be the area that you would want to contribute the most to.
Okay.
So why don't I bring that up and we can start.
Well, that's our least disastrous area anyway.
Let's take a look.
Except for the folks setting fire to.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that's right near me. I don't know.
What?
Oh, the Tesla charging station
Oh,
in Littleton
yeah.
was burnt down.
They set fire to 3 of the chargers.
Oh, 3 of them? Okay.
Intentionally?
Yep, that's what they think.
Yep.
Wait. I don't know.
I don't know. I think there's a lot of Trump hotels that could be burnt down.
I think there's other things to be done. I've been hearing about people putting stickers on people's Teslas saying they're, you know, bad people and worse. And most of us, you know, I've got one, Paul's got 2, who
Yeah.
bought them thought we were all doing the right thing at the time. So
Well, we were.
Do you guys have the bumper sticker that says, "I bought this before Elon went crazy"?
yeah,
I-
yeah, but I think there's groups that are going around putting bumper stickers on anyway.
Yeah.
So I thought, so what I thought would be interesting was start out with a historical perspective on the state's emissions. So this is just from state data. I've rearranged it a little bit. I've taken out, there's a couple of other categories. I'm only showing transportation, buildings, and electricity here. There's a non-energy category that's relatively small. And there's a category for, well, I'm not sure if that's lumped into non-energy, for you know, things like methane leaks and refrigerant leaks, which are relatively small. But I thought I'd just focus on, you know, the 3 main areas. And what this graph tells me is, if you look through at the graph from 1990, which is, you know, the baseline against we're measuring our progress, through 2019, which was the, you know, the last data of it, last date with actual data available. It's interesting to note that the transportation sector, which is this bottom one here, has made essentially 0 progress. I mean, it's more, the line for transportation is in 2019 is where it was, you know, 30 years ago. And, you know, what we're looking for is some fairly significant reductions in the transportation sector for 2025 and 2030. Similarly, for the building sector, it's reduced slightly from its 1990 levels through 2019. Not a hell of a lot, but almost all of that reduction can be attributed to the switch that took place over that period of time from fuel oil to natural gas in many buildings. So it was done, you know, by a lot of residents, you know, because they thought that that was well, and it is, or at least it was, you know, a economically better choice than fuel oil. So you know, there's other pie charts you can look at which show the gradual decrease in the use of fuel oil as a heating fuel, and you know, with a comparable increase in natural gas. The sector that has, you know, shown significant reduction in emissions through 2019 is the electric sector. You can see this green bar is, you know, much shorter now or was in 2019 than it was in 1990. And during that period of time, the use of electricity in the state was relatively flat. And maybe even during some, I think, Roy, you and I talked about that maybe before you went to New Zealand, that there's actually had been a decrease in electric demand in the state over the last 10 or 15 years, maybe even going back to 1990, I'm not sure. But again, almost all of that reduction can be attributed to the switch from coal and fuel oil for electric generation to natural gas. The use of renewables is, you know, through 2019 was relatively small, and it was actually the reduction in emissions from the use of renewables was actually more than offset by the retirement of the 2 nuclear plants that used to operate in Massachusetts. In fact, I remember taking a look, you know, at the 2020, 2021, 2022 timeframe, showing that in Massachusetts, we actually generated less clean electricity in 2021, 2022 than we did in 1990. So that was an interesting observation. And again, you can see in the building sector and in the electric sector, to meet our emissions limits this year and in 2030 will require significant reductions in those 2 sectors as well. Particularly, we'll talk about the building sector today, but as you can see, there hadn't been much progress in buildings, you know, for the 30 years that, you know, from 1990 through 2019. So any questions on that? I think it's interesting to see. And the other thing that, yes.
I was going to ask where the projections, how they did the projections.
Oh,
to
these are not they're both projections and they're limits. The roadmap bill that was signed into law by Governor Baker in 2021 set the emissions limit for 2030 as being 50% of the 1990 baseline. And then the Secretary of the EEA set the interim limit for 2025. The projections or the models are created to see what is it that we can do to meet those statutory limits. Roy, your hand is up.
Yeah, thanks, Arnie. The vertical axis here says CO2 equivalent. I assume I assume this does not include methane leaks for
it doesn't. Well, it doesn't include methane leaks only in the sense that, as I said earlier on, that if you look at the full emissions inventory for the state, it does have a small slice there for the estimate for methane leaks in state. That's not shown here. As I said, I thought this would just focus on the three major categories, but you're right. This does not include methane leaks. It doesn't include other so-called non-energy emissions from the agricultural sector and other things, but those are all small compared to these three main areas.
Yeah, that's my next question, how the methane leaks would compare to what we have here. But you're saying it's small. 'Cause some people dispute that and say it's equal magnitude. But anyway, so we're all on the same page. The CECP estimates that the gas leaks are
Yeah,
small.
I could hunt around. I'm sure we could all
Oh, no,
find
no,
that
no.
fairly quickly.
I'll look for it.
But it's it's on the order of 1% or less than 1% of this, at least what this, I understand that there are people who dispute the state's estimates. And in fact, not to go too far afield, Roy, when you were, I think we discussed this last week, and I'm still trying to get this sorted out with the EEA. The emissions associated with natural gas, as used in the state's greenhouse gas inventory, and as published by the EIA, do not include emissions associated with the extraction or transportation of natural gas. But for reasons that I don't understand, the latest Mass Save plan, the 2025 to 2027 plan, decided to include an estimate of those emissions and in fact increased the emissions factor for natural gas by, I think, about 23%. In so doing, I have no way of explaining. I mean, that may be true, but then you're comparing apples and oranges because all the rest of the state's greenhouse gas inventory does not use that higher emissions factor, and previous Mass Save plans didn't either. So I'm just puzzled by that.
Well, I see what makes the benefit cost analysis turn out better if you are reducing the amount of gas, both burnt and leaked.
It sure does. I mean, it means that, if you do the same measure under the 2025 to 2027 plan that you did in the previous 3-year plan, your emissions reductions are 23% higher,
Right.
which doesn't make much sense to me, but
yeah.
I'm trying to get some explanation for that. Any other questions on this?
Not for me, thank you.
So this bullets just, I think, summarize what we've already said. This now we're getting into the building sector. This is a cut and paste, this table here from the CECP for the building sector, showing again the 1990 baseline and what the actuals were through 2020 and what the targets are for 2025 and 2030. And helpfully, it actually breaks the building emissions into two categories. One's residential and the other's commercial, and has separate sublimits for each of them. An important, I think here, so this, remember, note here, I think is important and something I think, I'm 95% certain this is true, but I know that people sometimes, forget it or use a different way of accounting for emissions, both in the building sector and in the transportation sector. In the building sector, what's counted as emissions is what's called, on-site fuel emissions. So that's, when you burn propane or natural gas or fuel oil in your home, and that's the on-site emissions. When the emissions associated with whatever use you have currently of electricity and the emissions going forward from the use of electricity to power a heat pump are not counted as building emissions. They're counted separately in the electric sector. So it's something to keep in mind. So what is being shown here does not include the electricity that had been used historically in buildings, and the projection does not include the increased use of electricity to power heat pumps. Does that make sense? I know.
The part about not including electricity for heat pumps, that makes sense to me.
I mean, it is included, but it's included in a different sector. It's
Yeah,
included
it's
in the
included in
electric
the
sector.
energy sector, yeah.
So what emissions are there if you don't include heat pumps? It's just like outgassing from the insulation and stuff like that?
Well, what these numbers reflect is so-called on-site emissions, and that's from the burning of fuels, primarily to heat your home, also for hot water in certain instances, or your appliances. But that's what that's what these numbers reflect is those emissions, and not the emissions associated with the generation of electricity that you use in your home.
Wow, that sounds weird, because I mean, if we're aiming towards a day when we're all on heat pumps and there are no emissions, there's going to be a transfer of tonnage, GHG tonnage from the building sector to the electricity sector. That just doesn't
Right.
make sense.
Well, if you don't do that, you double count, right?
Yeah, I suppose.
So the assumption was that all the new electric usage is clean because of all our offshore wind we're not getting.
Mhm.
Certainly something to keep in mind when we're talking about either building or transportation emissions.
I mean, the same thing happens on transport, right? If you move to EVs, that the energy sector is picking up the emissions from the EVs.
Yeah. Okay, I'll keep that in mind. I hadn't before. Thanks for pointing that out.
Okay. So, this is the table showing what the targets are for the building sector through 2030, broken down by residential and commercial buildings. So the CECP, I don't know, I have spent, quite a bit of time looking at reading the CECP and the Clean Energy and Climate Plan. Is everybody here at least familiar with what the CECP is? I was surprised. We had a deep dialogue a week or so ago where, I asked a question about saying the CECP says we need such and such, and there was a question from the moderator saying, "What's the CECP?" So,
Oh yeah, is that Seth?
that was actually Michael.
Oh, Michael.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
But anyway, the CECP is as close as we get in the state to having sort of an official document saying how do we achieve the targets that have been set legislatively for emissions. And the so-called final CECP that was published in sometime in 2022 looked at, I think it was 5 different scenarios to achieve these emissions limits and picked the one they called the phased scenario. And this is another area where there's been a lot of discussion and disagreement. If you look at the phased scenario, and particularly if you look at the modeling done to achieve the phased scenario, particularly in the building sector, what the phase scenario calls for is a focus on so-called hybrid heating systems through 2030. And, you know, for those of you who are, you know, familiar with, you know, this so-called DPU Order 2080, which had to do with the future of gas, they have essentially discarded what the CECP scenario selected. But the modeling that was done and all of the numbers that you see and the scorecards and so on are all based on the modeling for this so-called phase scenario, which, as we'll see, shows that through 2030, the assumption is that 3/4 of homes that are retrofit with heat pumps become so-called hybrid heating systems, where the current fossil fuel furnace or boiler is kept and is used at very low temperatures. Starting in 2030, the phase scenario suggests that more and more retrofits will be so-called whole home retrofits, where there will be no backup. But through 2030, the assumption is that about in fact, exactly 3/4 of them in the modeling that was done are these so-called hybrid systems. Another thing that is in the CECP with the phase scenario is the use of low carbon fuels in 2030. And that includes biofuels mixed with fuel oil and renewable natural gas mixed with fossil gas. And again, that's an area that is highly controversial and has been discounted by, I think, essentially almost all climate groups in the state, and also has been discounted by the DPU in their 2080 order. But that's what this model is based on. So questions on that?
Is there any 2023 or 2024 data to show how close we are to the 2025 target?
Yeah, we'll get to that.
Oh, okay. Well, I saw you had like number of heat pumps.
Yeah,
Is that
there
yeah,
is.
okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
this is a cut and paste. There's a really interesting spreadsheet that the state has published showing the model results. And there's many tabs, but they have one tab called expanded metrics that sort of sums up the data for the other tabs. And this one, the part of this expanded metrics tab that I cut and pasted here is the one having to do with residential buildings. So it has, you know, the estimate of the total number of households, and then breaks that down by, you know, how many homes have, you know, different types of heating systems. And you can see here, I think, that if you can see my cursor, this hybrid heating systems, that goes to point 2030 month. Hybrid heating system. Huh. Now I'm confused. I'm sorry. What am I missing here? I'm looking at a number that's showing, if you see my cursor, it's showing 0.61 million homes with hybrid heating systems in 2030. If I understand that number correctly. Oh, I know what it is. Yes, I'm sorry. So that's 600. Yeah, I got myself confused. The numbers that you see for the CECP goals are installations from 2020 to 2030. In 2020, the assumption is, or the belief is, that there was already 220,000 homes out of the 2.6 million that already had a heating system, a heat pump of some sort. So if you subtract this 0.61 from the 0.22, which is the number of hybrid heating systems that were already installed by 2020, then you get a number like 350,000, I believe. And you can see there's a line here for homes with, electric resistance heating that stays about constant, goes down a little slightly. And then there's two other lines showing the number of homes with either air source or ground source whole home heating systems. And those go from, a very small number in the case of, geothermal heat pumps, I think that's 20,000 to 40,000 in 2030. And whole home heat pumps using air source heat pumps goes from 40,000 to 140,000. So that's what the model projects. And they also have a data on number of homes that are weatherized. And then they get down to this row here, which is really what the target is. This row here, residential on-site building emissions, is according to them, 12.2 million tons of CO2, or million megatons. Paul, do you know? What is MMT? Or Fran or somebody?
I think that's right, million metric tons.
Million metric tons, okay. Goes from 12.2 to 7.8 in 2030 with an interim goal of 10.8 in 2025. And we're going to look at that more below, but they have another very interesting set of numbers here. This is all a sort of a compilation of data that's you can see in other tabs in the spreadsheet, which shows what their assumption, what the current use of the different home heating fuels is, as well as electricity, and what the projected use is in 2025 and 2030, presumably in order to meet our targets. Now, I took a fairly close look at these numbers over the last few days, and I will show you later on. This does not add up for me. So I'm missing something, or maybe the EEA did something. I have been in touch with the EEA about this, but I'll show you later on why I'm very confused about these numbers. But this these numbers, 12.2, 10.8, and 7.8 should line up if I'm lucky. Yeah, with these numbers up here from the CECP. That, you know, what the model is doing is just coming up with an approach to meet these targets. And there's, you know, that these are the targets. And they believe that the model that they've created achieves those targets. And this is coming back to, you know, these are numbers you probably, this number is probably one you've seen before, that they're saying in order to achieve the target, we have to have just about 500,000 heat pumps installed between 2020 and 2030, 510,000 to be exact. And that comes directly from those numbers above. That's somewhat of a confusing number, a little bit because the draft CECP, which was published 2 years prior to the final CECP, said that number was double, said the number should be about 1 million. So it was very confusing, and still is, how it was that we were able to cut the number of heat pumps that needed to be installed in half. I can't explain that, but if you look at the draft CECP, that's what it says. It says 1 million. Roy,
Well,
The question, Arnie, is it literally the number of heat pumps, or is it the number of homes that have heat pumps installed into them? Because
I don't know for sure, Roy, whether
Yeah.
which one it means, but in the draft CECP, it says approximately 1 million homes will have heat pumps installed. Now, I don't know how many heat pumps per home that means. I mean, that's a significant fraction of, you can see that there's, you know, they're estimating 2.8 million homes in Massachusetts in 2030. If 1 million of them have heat pumps, you know, then we got a lot of them.
Yeah.
Mhm. But if it's not homes and it's just heat pumps, then it could be different assumptions about how many people have whole house versus room by room.
Draft CECP has no information that I ever found on this whole home versus hybrid heat pump question.
Well, I'm
And
just saying, are they counting mini splits as heat pumps? That's
Sure,
that's
why
my.
not?
Well, then that can inflate the number, because you could have 5 of those in a house, right? Whereas if you do a whole house, it's only one, and so that's why you need to be talking households, I think, not just heat pumps, because heat pumps come in all different sizes.
Well, yeah, but that would be, I mean, if anything, if the draft CECP says, which it does, you know, 1 million homes,
It says homes. Okay.
yes,
Yeah. So then
then
that would only make it worse.
that would
Right.
only make it worse.
Yeah. Okay.
And then it, you know, the other thing it assumes, and again, I, you know, just point out this is very controversial, that by 2030 there would be significant use of biofuels in fuel oil.
I guess
and
the
some
draft could assume they were all hybrid. I mean, that would count for some decrease.
could, but it doesn't. I couldn't find anything that spoke to that in the draft CECP.
I guess one of the other sort of underlying points that you're making is that there isn't a straightforward assumption in here of what the savings are or the emissions from, you know, per household with heat pump versus household with gas, so that you can kind of track the data as we go along year by year of how many heat pumps are installed, and sort of calculate ourselves what that impact is on emissions.
Yeah,
All
I
done
took
through their complicated modeling.
there is, and I took a swag at that I'll show you later, just to, you know, just to see if these numbers even look like they were in the ballpark based on, you know, assumptions and approximations about how much energy was used to heat a home annually on average, and what would be the savings per home if you did a
Yeah,
whole home. So yeah, I did try to, and I show that a little bit later, but
good.
so here I think this paragraph, I'm just saying that what should be the case, and I think I mentioned this earlier, I did mention this earlier, is that this number, or this row of residential on-site building emissions, should be just the sum of the emissions from each of the heating fuel types listed below. So if they say that there's 115 trillion BTU of natural gas consumed in homes in 2020, you multiply that by the emissions factor for natural gas and do the same for fuel oil and do the same for propane and add that all up, and it should come up to this 12.2 number. Do people believe that? I certainly, that's my belief. Because electricity, we said earlier, that doesn't count
Right.
towards emissions in the home. They have this other category, which I'm not sure what it is, but it's relatively small. I mean, it might be wood, I don't know what it is, but we do know what the emissions factor is for propane, fuel oil, and natural gas. And what I did was I multiplied, the use of each of those fuels by their respective emissions factor, added them up, and they did not come to 12.2.
Was it less, Arne?
It was significantly less. It was
So maybe-
not hugely less. It was like, rather than 12.2, it was a number like 10.5 or 10.7 or something.
So maybe you also
20.
need to factor in the efficiency of the heating appliance and
Well,
gross. So if the gas is 95% efficient.
I don't think so, because this is saying this is the actual consumption of those fuels. So even if your furnace is 80%, 75% efficient, you're
Right.
still burning that amount of fuel oil. So it shouldn't matter what the efficiency is. That's my take anyway.
The efficiency is controlling how much you need, not
It's how
how.
much you actually get out of
Yeah.
burning that amount of fuel, but it doesn't. But this says you're burning that amount of fuel, and if you're burning that amount of fuel,
Yeah, I'm not convinced. I understand what you're saying. I'm not convinced that that's what they mean here, because when they talk about BTUs of electricity, that's different than BTUs of heat from fuel oil. When you burn fuel oil, it's maybe 85% efficient, and when you burn electricity, it's 100% efficient. So, yeah, they're not directly comparable. So maybe if it's easy for you, there's what, 6 items here. Maybe when you look at it again, you could plug in efficiency factors and see if that makes it, brings it closer to the total above.
no, it would certainly raise it, because people typically use numbers like 90% efficient for
Yep.
natural gas and 80% efficient for fuel oil. But I took it to mean, well, I'll tell you another, before we go there, I did the same calculation for the 2030 target. Said, okay, they said you've reduced the amount of natural gas, fuel oil, and propane from this much to this much in 2030. I initially just multiplied it by the same emissions factor for each fuel, and again came up with a different number than this 7.8. But what I then did is I said, okay, they said in their assumption for this model that they use 5% of pipeline gas in 2030 is renewable natural gas, and 20% of fuel oil is biofuel, is low carbon gas. So I took each of these numbers in 2030, or I took the fuel oil number, multiplied it by, 0.8 to reflect the fact that, 20% of it was, I assume, zero carbon. It's obviously not, but just for getting a swag. And did the same thing with natural gas. And when I then added those numbers up, I got a number almost precisely equal to this 7.8. I think I got a number like 7.9.
Hmm.
So I'm not sure what to make of that at this point,
Yeah.
but it
Are,
does.
are they, you said this table was copied from the spreadsheet from the.
Yeah, I can show you the
You
spreadsheet.
don't need to. Just one more question. I wonder if the cells in the spreadsheet are hard numbers or if they're formulas that you could trace back and see what their assumptions are.
They're hard numbers. You can't, you can open, I have several references to that spreadsheet in this
Yeah.
document. You can open it up. But if you just, click on the number, it's just a number. It doesn't.
Hmm. Hmm.
But so right now, I am just puzzled by this thing because
Yeah,
the
me
numbers do add up for 2030 if you put in this assumption about, the use of biofuels and renewable natural gas, but they do not add up for 2020. Which suggests to me, Roy, for example, that this question about efficiency really is, why would it add up? Why would things be more efficient in 2030 than in 2020? But again, I've sent an email to, a representative of DEA. She's gotten back to me. She said, very interesting question. She'll get back to me. So that's where that stands right now.
Well, they're asking all the right questions. Hope to get the answers.
Mhm.
But it's
But to,
So-
to summarize what you're concerned about is that by lowering both, but not changing the way the number on the earlier one, they've created a sense of an artificial decrease.
they've created a sense of an artificial decrease. When I looked at the calculation that I made for
Right,
building emissions based on these numbers and their emissions coefficient
right.
and compared it to these numbers,
Yeah, we're getting like half the decrease
we're
that they
getting
say.
like less than half the decrease that they say that they're achieving.
Right.
And I have no explanation for that,
Okay.
but I hope to.
Yeah, well, like reading lab reports.
Let's see, and then so here's where we are against these targets, even though, although I'm suggesting that maybe these metrics that they're using of, number of heat pumps installed, maybe incorrect. But, this was the scorecard that is published by the state showing through 2023, and just looking at, where did I put this? Somewhere. Oh, so with the last data that we had, we were, just looking at numbers of heat pumps. We were about 30% towards, and this was at Q1 and Q2 of 2023. So this data is probably a year and a half old. But at that point, we were about 30% of the way towards achieving our 2025 target for heat pumps installed, and only about 6% of the way of achieving our target for heat pumps installed for 2030. And, and I'm suggesting that number of heat pumps installed is probably is quite possibly an underestimate. So, we'll hopefully find out, but the 6% number suggests that towards 2030 suggests that we've got a long way to go.
Ernie, if you scroll up a little bit, there's a comment saying you don't know if there's any, you're not aware of any way to ensure 20% of fuel oil is biofuel. And we have the clean heat standard, right? Or will have that. Doesn't that address that? And there's also a low sulfur standard, and I may be mixing things up, but I get bioheat for my fuel oil, heating oil, and I think it's 20% vegetable oil mixed in with diesel. Um, but do you know what's going on there with either the low sulfur requirement, which can be met by substituting vegetable oil for fossil fuel, or the clean heat standard? They must be addressing this.
Standard, which we're trying to get a deep dialogue on the clean heat standard later this month. I've been in touch with a couple of people there, but they are, or at least what they want to do is they want to prevent RNG from being counted as towards achieving a clean heat standard. You can't get a clean heat standard certificate for using RNG. At least that's the way they want to do it, which seems, to be, on the face of it, running counter to what the CECP says, that you're not going to get a certificate from the clean heat standard for putting RNG in the gas pipeline, presumably because they want to discourage its use. Then, why does the CECP say we're going to do this? Right? It just doesn't add up. I don't, for the fuel oil, I don't know of specific requirements. I think the clean heat standard is also trying to bar the use of biofuels and fuel oil from being counted towards achieving, progress in the clean heat standard. Fran, you may know something about that. I don't. But I do know that, that there's a real effort to prevent either of those from being counted. And that the only other state that has a clean heat standard is Vermont. And they do allow, mixing of low carbon liquid and gas fuels. But certainly what I know about what's happening in Massachusetts, they do not.
I'll talk to my oil dealer and
Okay.
get back to you when I learn something.
Yeah, but so I think you're right that even today there is significant mixing of biofuels with fuel oil in the stuff that you get delivered to your home. So this gets down to, I think, Fran's question is, are these numbers in the table even approximately correct? Can we do a sort of a bottom-up calculation and just see if they're in the same ballpark as what is shown in that table? So I took a look at that. First of all, you have to make an assumption of what the average heating energy use is per year per typical home. And, I did a little Googling, you come up with somewhat different numbers for Massachusetts. 100 MMBTU is about where, is what I used. And then, I could have done a more exact calculation about the emissions factor to use for heating fuels. All of the, natural gas has a somewhat lower emissions factor than either fuel oil or propane. I sort of took an average but they're not all that different. And I took an average and said, let's call it 0.06 megatons CO2 per MMBTU. And then assume that it's more than, if you have a whole house heat pump, then it displaces 100% of your on-site heating fuel use. For a hybrid heating system, it's a real toss-up about how much heating fuel you actually displace. I've, in the CECP document itself, it suggests that they use the number 50%. And in the email exchange I've had with EEA, they say, we think that's correct. I'm going to double check on that, but that's the number I used. I said for the hybrid heating system, you're displacing 50% of your on-site heating fuel use.
Seems
And
quite-
then these are the numbers in this last bullet that, that we saw earlier for the numbers installed. And, you can add all that stuff up and you find what you find is that you get a reduction in annual emissions from residential buildings about 1.9 million megatons of CO2 in 2030 this should be in 2030 as compared to 2020. That in fact is almost exactly what I got by using this method of calculating. I was amazed, I got about 1.9 as the difference between adding up the emissions from the use of these fuels, this amount of these fuels and this amount of these fuels for 2030. But it does, it doesn't come, it's less than half of the 4.4 that they're claiming for, installing, that amount of those types of heat pumps. So I guess, so there seems to be some correlation, something seems to be more or less in the ballpark, but it doesn't come close to what the CECP is claiming. I know this is gone. Is any of this clear?
Well, it raises a red flag for me that if we're only getting half the benefit from the heat pumps because we're only cutting the on-site heating fuel use by half, are the mass save incentives like way overpriced? We're paying too much for only half the benefit we're expecting.
No, well, I mean, the mass save incentives are structured currently to really encourage whole home heat pump retrofits. So you get, with the last 3-year plan, you got a $10,000 rebate for doing a whole home retrofit. Whereas, if you did a hybrid system, it was just a rebate, per ton of, of heat pump capacity. And I think that's even, it's an even stronger incentive in the new 3-year plan to go whole home rather than hybrid.
So I just wanted to comment on that the hybrid heating system displacing 50%.
Yeah.
I think that's a big overestimate.
Yeah, it could be. I mean, in your case, you're probably like 10% or maybe less.
Right, exactly. And if 75% of the heat pump installations are hybrid, then it seems like there's a big gap.
Yeah. But I have a hybrid heating system and I displace 85% of my fuel use.
Yeah.
So it's all over the map. I mean, Betty, I understand, we've talked about this before. You had the heat pumps installed and you use them primarily for air conditioning, I think, is what you said, and maybe a little bit.
I use it
shoulder months.
some in the winter, but if you've got a whole house in winter and the temperature outside is cold, you've got to run your whole house system. It's not enough to run the, room by room heat pumps.
So you haven't noticed, or have you noticed any significant reduction? I forget whether you're fuel oil or gas. You must be gas.
Gas. And I don't know, I haven't tracked it that carefully, but I also have just one zone and I have steam radiators.
right,
Like, yikes.
right.
Right.
So,
I read something the other day actually about New York and installations of heat pumps and stuff. And they were saying that so much of New York is steam heat that it was proving to be a real problem to, change over to more efficient systems.
oh yeah, I mean, any hydronic, whether it's steam or hot water, you cannot use that heating distribution system with a heat pump. At least, no. So you have to, you either have to install ductwork throughout your house or just have a whole bunch of mini splits.
Well, I got 100% displacement.
Yeah,
I
there
was
you
gonna
go.
say, I'm going without a net,
Mm.
so I have no backup.
So we,
Looking at that spreadsheet, I mean, it
yeah,
does have formulas for pretty much everything except for the right, that the carbon number.
oh, okay,
So if you look, I mean, everything else is calculated and refers to other, I mean, they go across pages, right?
I can put up that.
But the numbers are calculated. It's just you just get to the final number and it's just entered in.
I actually, I created my own tab here to send to the EEA folks, but this
Mhm.
is the spreadsheet we're talking about.
Yeah, the residential energy
Okay.
one, right? So if you look at total energy, right,
Yeah.
it shows it's just a
Yeah, so it's
summation,
just some. Oh, okay, final
right?
energy, so this one,
So yeah, that goes to another tab.
I
It
think it
goes to
goes to
tab
another tab
7,
called final energy demand, yeah.
right? So there are, I mean, it is a regular spreadsheet. They didn't just throw in numbers except
Okay,
where you come to the
these numbers,
emissions. The
okay,
emission
yeah,
numbers
yeah,
are there
yeah,
without any
yeah, okay,
connection, right?
right, right,
But the other
yeah,
numbers are,
okay,
so
so.
it's kind of interesting.
So you can see that there's, if you're interested, I mean, there's all sorts of data here showing what, the assumed number of homes and
Yeah, you can
types of,
compare us to Vermont and Connecticut
yeah,
if you
there's
want.
all sorts of stuff. If you're, it is the result of their, their model results.
Hmm.
So I don't know if I'm boring everybody here. Want to go on to,
Well, we need some sort of a system for either getting the state to change their numbers or explain how we need to change our numbers or I mean you're raising sort of empirical questions. We need to get to the bottom of
Hmm.
what calculations actually took place that the state was using or that you're using, and so we can explain it. So you're on a virtuous path of trying to figure all that out.
Yeah.
And we ought to like encourage you and you can let us know when you get it all figured out, right?
yeah,
Hmm.
Then there's another element of, are we installing enough heat pumps? Whatever assumptions are being used about the fuel and emissions for each heat pump, are we installing enough of them? And presumably the answer is no, not yet, right?
right. In fact, the the latest 3-year plan, the 2027 plan, has a target of installing 100,000 heat pumps over that 3-year period. And clearly, with the 500,000 heat pump goal and, through 2030, and I think, we have installed, maybe 100,000 from 2020 through 2025, that, that would mean that through the end of 2027, we're, maybe, what is that, 200, so that's 40% of the way there. Maybe that, but an interesting thing about the Mass Save plan is that, one interesting thing I already pointed out was when Secretary Tepper wrote the letter to the Mass Save program administrators. She said, your target should be, I think it was a 1 MMT CO2, whereas we've seen, the overall target between 2020 and 2030 is 4.4 in the residential sector. She also said, I'd like you to do and then she also used those much higher emissions factors for the fuels, which I'm totally confused about. But she also said, I'd like you to do another calculation. What would it take to get a 2.2 reduction in CO2 emissions from this 3-year plan? And the program administrators did another analysis and came back and said, and presumably, I can't think of another reason why the secretary would have suggested doing that, other than to say that if we got 2.2 rather than 1, we would be on a trajectory towards meeting our CECP targets. And the program administrators wrote a very interesting analysis of what, first of all, they said, we really, that this is all very, very low confidence data. We really don't know how we could achieve that. But they said that, if you wanted to, our best guess at this point with low confidence is that it would cost over $16 billion to do that with this 3-year plan. As you know, the 3-year plan was $5 billion, and it was just last couple of days was cut down to 4.5 billion. So the 16 billion number was, even at low confidence was, out of the question. But they also had some interesting data there saying, this would be very, very difficult to achieve. They had another thing that speaks to what I think Betty was saying, saying what their assumptions were for the type of heating distribution system was in a particular building based on when the building was built or when the home was built. And I don't remember exactly, but they said something like, if the home was built 1940 or 1945 or earlier, then we're going to assume 100% of those homes are either hot water or steam. And if the home was built between, I forget exactly, 1950 and 2000, I'm screwing these numbers up a little bit, it's about 50-50 between hot water and steam versus forced hot air. And post 2000, we're going to assume 100% forced hot air. So, so that's interesting, and because it tells you something that older buildings, not only are they're poorly insulated and air sealed, but they have that they're less easy, they're more difficult to get a good heat distribution system in the house because you cannot use either your steam radiators or your hot water baseboards for distributing the heat. Anyway, I did do a similar thing for electricity. It actually showed, what I did is I plugged in the CECP assumed, and for those of you who were at the Jennifer's Deep Dialogue, I guess that was a week ago Monday, where she went over the various offshore wind projects and what the likelihood of them actually moving forward and being operational by 2030 was. And I took screenshots of each of her presentation pages because, that's information was not to be made public. And she, the ELM requested that the presentation not be recorded. But it appeared to me that what she was saying was that the only project that was likely to be operational by 2030 was the one called Vineyard 1, which is 800 megawatts. And the CECP assumes 3.2 gigawatts for 2030. So we're looking most likely at, a quarter of the offshore wind available in 2030 that was needed to achieve the emissions limits in the electric subsector. Other areas, I'm not so sure. I mean, it also assumed that all of the Hydro-Quebec project was completed, and it assumed a pretty dramatic increase in solar. And those may be moving forward. But, the bottom line, very much of an estimate, assuming that it's still true that the Hydro-Quebec project will be completed and that the added solar will be installed by 2030, that, we get to something like, 65% of the goal for 2030. So that not on track, but not terrible either. That's where I sort of landed with a very back of the envelope calculation. So Paul, I'm sort of wondering whether you would take up and do something similar for
The transport.
the transport sector. I can show you quickly what I've, for the electric sector, I did something not.
Well, I mean, so it's basically a vehicle miles travel
Yeah,
conversion.
Well, and then I did do another section at the end I called headwinds, what are the issues that we're facing in terms of achieving our goals? Top of the list obviously is our new administration. They're just totally hostile to everything that we're trying to accomplish. So no words to express what is going on there.
Yeah.
But the other thing, and I think it's actually, is that other New England states are starting to backpedal on their own targets. I was just reading this morning that Maine is also considering, rethinking their emissions targets in the near term. But there's been articles about Vermont reevaluating their climate goals, and I mentioned earlier that they're the only state that have actually had formally legislated a clean heat standard. They're rethinking that now. They think it may be too expensive for Vermont residents. Connecticut was part of a multi-state procurement of offshore wind that, they abandoned that a couple of months ago again because of the projected cost of building their part of that project. And just in the last few weeks, we're seeing what's happening in Massachusetts, where it sort of came to light, I think, with natural gas, which is strange. I guess not strange, but because natural gas was always being held up as the lowest cost fuel to heat your home. Lower certainly than propane or fuel oil, and lower than using an air source heat pump. But people are, up in arms about the cost of natural gas and the increase in the price of natural gas that was approved by the DPU last November. we're gonna see the same thing with electricity. We're already starting to see it. I am in discussions with, there's some of us who have been doing a review of why our electric rates are as high as they are. This is a cut and paste from a presentation from Eversource a little over a month ago at a state working group called Financing the Transition. And this breaks down the retail cost of electricity from Eversource over the last 10 years, from 2014 to 2025 by component. And this is distribution, this light blue. Let's see. The green here is transmission. This is public benefits. We can talk about what that is. And this is so-called, they call it supply RPS plus RGGI. And this is the actual cost of the electricity itself. So, and then they broke it down for 2025 by component. The actual cost, the supply side cost totaled, I think it's 38% of the total retail cost of electricity, but of that, that's further broken down to 28% for the electricity itself and 10% for the cost of meeting the RPS and RGGI obligations. They've since sent me a spreadsheet with the data behind all this graph, and I have a meeting set up with them because I still have some questions on this. But one thing that stands out to me is that the policy components of your bill quadrupled over the last 10 years. They went from 2.5 cents, which to 10 cents kilowatt hour. And those components are what's called public benefit. That's, mass save, net metering, low income discounts. There's several others. And on the supply side, it's the cost of RPS, which is the Renewable Portfolio Standard, plus other supply side policy components. There's a clean energy standard, there's a clean peak standard, all of which, cost some money. The Renewable Portfolio Standard is the largest one and has been growing year by year as the RPS obligation increases. And RGGI is a smaller component. I have the actual breakdown of that. But, for me, what this says is that, these public policy costs that are intended to, clean up our energy supply, energy both in terms of generation and use, are, now costing us, what is it? Just about 30%, 29% of our, for IOU customers. And, and that's pretty significant.
And counterproductive.
And potentially counterproductive. So, we've already seen, the Mass Save program get, clipped a little bit. I wouldn't be surprised if, there's other things going on. So I think we've sort of reached the point, possibly in the state where, residents are unwilling to pay more to, to do this energy transition to clean energy. And so we've got to rethink this.
Mhm.
So,
This is really good info to characterize the problem and quantify it, the extra costs. One thing I don't see here is the greenhouse gas benefits and the social cost of
no, this is
social
just,
value of,
this is just
This is like
straight on rates.
right. I understand. So if we look at the 2014 rate of or bill, I guess, 100
That's actually a
or
bill.
so.
You have to divide that by
Right.
600 to get the rate.
And we saw how many tons of emissions there were in 2014, then compare how many tons of emissions there are in 2025.
what's
and
the
value
bang per
those at-
buck.
Yeah, value those at $200 a ton for the EPA. Does that make it look better or, you know?
I think it probably doesn't, because one of the things that was also shown is the percent, the emissions factor for electricity in Massachusetts has not changed much in the last 10 years. I mean, we had made the transition from coal and oil to natural gas.
Right.
10 years ago, we still had Pilgrim running.
Mhm.
So approximately half of the electricity, half, as you all know, half the electricity is coming from natural gas, and the other half is predominantly, clean sources, and that's been the case for the last 10 years. And the emissions and the demand has been, pretty flat to negative. So I think if you look at it from a social cost of carbon perspective, I don't think there's been any significant reduction in carbon emissions from the electric sector. Although actually we could actually, maybe there has been. We could go back to, there's that first thing that I was showing you. This does show, well, no, it doesn't. I mean, well, because this is all, this data 2010 to 1990. This was when we were still using, a significant amount of oil and coal for electric generation. And by 2015, we sort of made the transition, although it's showing a fairly significant reduction in emissions from the electric sector from 2015 to 2019. Roy, maybe there is a benefit. Although looking at the 2025 number, it's back to where it was in 2015.
Yeah, that's not very.
So no, I mean, these numbers don't consider the social cost of carbon. We've had that long discussion about, what value do you put on a ton of carbon, and it seems to be, from what we saw and how they used it in the last 3-year Mass Save plan, they just adjusted the figure until it looked like whatever measure you did had a benefit. So
Fran posted the annual emissions, so you could get that rough estimate by just dividing one number into the other.
okay.
Yeah, it was going down for a while, just as Arnie was saying, but it's not, it's
Kind of
more-
leveled off the
Yeah.
last
So
4 years.
I wanted to ask whether our mission here is or should be to make the case that it's still a good idea to try to reduce emissions. I mean, we could acknowledge that the public is getting impatient, that costs are increasing, that we got those headwinds that you were talking about, Arnie, and that it doesn't look like these numbers are going to be easy to achieve in the 2030 timeframe. Maybe it'll be easier in 2040 or something. But we could say, well, our mission is to help support public support of the finance. We can make the case that, by spending these monies and running these programs, we're, um, you know, addressing the climate crisis and reducing asthma and everything else. Or, is that obvious to people, or is that, unlikely to succeed? People are pissed off, and so we don't want to like just sort of go against the this the um the deterioration of public support for climate action. Well, because we've got good numbers here, and some of it's like we need to work with the state to make sure that if they're screwing up, we've got good numbers. But and we're talking in other contexts about, well, should we be pushing for more carbon pricing? Should we be shifting money from the rates to the taxes? But what about making the argument that this is all that there are benefits that justify these costs?
Mhm.
I mean,
I
Didn't
thought,
somebody
first of
send
all,
around-
it'd be good to just figure out where we really are and
Where we are.
where
Yeah,
we're
we
just-
likely to be
where we
before
are.
then we got to figure out how to message it. I think was what I was done. Betty, you were
Yeah.
starting to say something?
Yeah, I didn't Ed Wall send around an article on, or somebody else did as well, on how to talk about this for the future and make it a, clean jobs, that kind of thing, as opposed to talking as much about climate change and the benefits of reducing emissions, but, talk about it more as pocketbook issues and what would be good for the future in terms of industrialization and so forth.
Yeah, I wasn't even really thinking of the messaging so much. I'm hoping somebody's got a good grip on that, because I don't feel like I have a good grip on how to make the message sound right to people. But it seems like that would be an analytical task that we could undertake to kind of come up with the sort of the quantitative basis for what's the upside from these programs.
I agree with you that we need to think about how to make this look better. And hopefully be correct at the same time.
I wanted to give some good news, so we're not all leaving depressed. So I went to the MBTA meeting and the rail transformation meetings this last week, and things seem to be really going very, very well with the MBTA. I mean, they've gotten all their slow stuff. Places have all been eliminated, right? They've added new safety systems, so that's encouraging there. There's a new rail line, a southern something, that going to New Bedford and Fall River, and that starts in another week or two. They've electrified the Fairmont line. That allows for more frequent trains. So they're going from 45 minutes to 30 minutes. They found after just a few months, the ridership has increased by 20%. They say normally it takes years to start seeing increases and that to get a large increase in just a few months is astounding and very hopeful. There've several lines they're decreasing to 30-minute service, and they're taking some of those to 20 minutes before too long. If they can, once they electrify, they can get it to 20 minutes. And the plan is to get it down to 5 minutes on several of the lines. And they feel a lot of this can happen, and they also feel they can get 70% of the carbon benefits at 10% of the total cost if they, do low-hanging fruit approaches. And it turns out you don't gain a whole lot by just electrifying, except, when you're at the shorter times, you get like basically they said if they electrify everything, it ends up you replace 300 trucks. But if you just increase the frequency on all the lines, you can replace tens of thousands of cars at less cost. And so depending on how they spend the money, they can get a lot of impact, and they're starting to look at cheaper impact. And so it seems like things are already happening and that their heads are in the right place and they're moving forward at a really good rate. This guy Eng, who runs it, seems to be it's back when the Boston Police had Bratton, he was like the star and we did everything. It's the same sort of thing. It seems like we have the star in running a mass transit system, and he's really getting their act together.
Great. Well, it's about time.
Yeah, it is about time.
Uh,
But projects that
well,
have been 20 years in the working are now getting done in like 6 months,
yeah,
right?
that's great. So you mentioned the Fall River line. I understand that's free for the first month, at least on
Yeah, it's going to
weekends,
be
so we
free.
could all
And
try it out.
then for weekends too, I think
Yeah.
afterwards.
Can you comment on why electrified lines are more amenable to running more frequently? What's the deal with that?
Yeah, I didn't ask. I didn't think about that. I don't know. It was mentioned, like
Maybe
so
it's
they can
faster
get to 20
acceleration
minutes.
out of the station. What is
Oh,
that
it could
possible?
be. Maybe that's it. Could be the accelerations.
Or I wonder if there's like an emissions cap on the diesel locomotives, because they put a lot of particulates, and maybe if there's no limit, then you just run
Yeah.
it off
Yeah, I
the
don't know.
top.
It wasn't mentioned. It just said that the going from 30 minutes to 20 minutes was electrification. Um, I mean, they're built, there's other things that make a big difference, just having a turnaround. So you don't have to run a train all the way to the end, right? And you don't have to have double tracks everywhere. If you just have certain areas where you put doubled tracks, you can get a lot more efficiency. So they're really trying to figure out how to be cost effective and save a lot. That all said, a big problem is permitting still. Um, and it's just if you're anywhere near wetlands, suddenly everything gets more expensive and takes twice as long. And it's not that, it's because you have to deal town by town. And so it's not just dealing with one entity, but it could be 40 entities. Um, so along those lines, Crichton has a bill dealing with that we've talked to Crichton, and it looks like that might be one of our priorities to keep this going
Would you be
quick.
willing to do a section like the building section we looked through for transportation on
Yeah, I
how
can.
we-
That's what I plan to do that stuff anyway. So yeah.
because
Well,
you
you mean
may
like what
have
you
to,
just did today? You're talking about, or
yeah, that's
yeah,
something that we
yeah,
could put
yeah,
together, and then something that we talked at the
yeah,
previous meeting about after
yeah.
doing a sort of a synthesis, we might
Mm-hmm.
break it apart and do separate
Mm-hmm.
presentations on each sector.
Yeah, yeah,
And
yeah,
I'm not sure, but I think, when you look at the scorecards and metrics for the CECP, it's all EVs, and
yeah.
so you might have to
Yeah. Well,
say,
that
look,
is you need to get them out of gas cars, and whether
right,
it's into an EV or into a train. Actually, you're better off
right,
getting them into a train, right? So they're both
right.
there, but the bottom line is getting them out of gas cars.
But
Uh,
there's also, I think, projections on vehicle miles traveled,
yeah, the VM, yeah,
yeah,
which is the bottom line on that.
yeah.
Um,
Yeah, so if you
the
could do that, and maybe, like you're saying, maybe that, there's getting people, out of cars into other forms of transportation is a
yeah,
more significant factor than was,
well,
considered at the time that
yeah,
the CECP was done.
Gotta go. Thanks for the good news, Paul.
Thanks.
sure.
Information.
All right. So we are not meeting next week, right? It's the chapter meeting.
Chapter meeting. Okay.
So week after that, Paul, would that be a
I don't know. I'm
reasonable?
away next week, so I don't know how productive I can be.
Oh, you can be productive.
I can be productive. You're productive in Florida. I should be able to, right? I don't know. I can
Meeting.
try. I can try.
Okay, and hopefully I will have answers to those questions about the CECP.
Okay.
by that time. I guess that, and then, yeah, if you haven't already, send Ed your list of passions, 3 passions.
Yeah, yep.
Okay. Anything else before we wrap it up?
Yeah, Artie, I had a question on the CECP for 2050. If I could share my screen, I'd
Yeah.
just like to ask you a question.
Sure. There's two CEC, there's the one that I've been referencing is the CECP for 2025 and 2030. And
Right,
then there's a CECP for 2050.
right. So the one you've been referencing is was dated June 2022, I believe.
Yeah, I think that sounds right.
And this one is dated December of the same year, so more recent, I think. Oh, there we go. So I just had I don't know if they changed the numbers, the targets between June and December. I haven't compared these yet, but let's see if I can blow this up.
So wasn't one a draft?
Well, there was a
There-
draft in 2020.
Oh,
Then there was
okay.
a final in the for 2025 and 2030 in 2022. And Roy, you're saying that was actually early in 2022.
Yeah, the 2051 that we're looking at now was dated December 2022.
Yeah.
But my question is on this industrial processes, the opposite sign to all the other sectors
yeah.
Yeah,
sublimits. So does this mean that industrial processes would increase by 27% instead of
Yes.
decreasing?
Yeah.
I didn't see anything in the footnotes or in the text to explain the different sign for that one.
I think it's mostly, well, maybe it's not. I thought it was refrigerants.
Uh,
Oh.
but yeah,
And then you can see that yeah, the
Could be
one that
construction.
I was talking about before that I didn't include, natural gas distribution.
right. And as you said, it was very
Yeah.
small, which is too small to be credible in my view.
Well,
but it's what they wrote, so we'll go
Yeah.
with it for now.
yeah, I believe that's the case, that industrial processes, we're not a highly industrialized state anymore. So I don't think that the fact that actually goes up in terms of emissions.
So
Makes-
we're not worried about that. All right, that was my question. So
Now,
Yeah, I
could
think-
that be thinking of all the stuff that's going to be related to our massive increase of wind that they were anticipating a industrial
That could, maybe,
rebirth?
yeah, maybe. I don't know for sure. No. But
So I
it's-
had a dream and that I woke up and was living in Russia. But now I'm not sure. Was it a dream?
huh, it might be better than being here.
I don't know.
All right,
Okay.
all right, Paul. Where were you going to be?
West Palm Beach or
Oh,
something. I think I'm a couple hours from you,
okay.
but I
More
don't
than
know.
that.
Maybe we could meet mid-state.
Yeah, and look at transportation.
So you're gonna be near Mar-a-Lago then, it sounds like?
I believe I am. Yeah, I'm going to pass. Well, I guess I could protest, or I could bring a Ukrainian flag or something.
Well,
Well,
so I stopped by there and tried to get in, and they wouldn't let me in.
Oh,
Because I wasn't a member. I just said, well, I'd like to see the place and see if I want to become a member. And
oh,
but then I drove around the back side, and it looked like his front lawn is like 3 feet above sea level or lago level or whatever.
oh, okay.
Which, I mean, they get hurricanes in
Yeah, yeah.
beach, and they certainly get storm surge and all that. I mean, he should be very interested in doing. So if you go down there, please check my memory if it's like.
All right. If I drive by, I'll look and see what it is. I don't know.
And my wife is actually at a
I'll get arrested
protest.
for pissing on his lawn, probably.
My wife is actually at a protest in Sarasota right now.
Oh,
Oh,
good for
yeah.
her.
Well, and good for, so Florida isn't entirely the way we hear about it. I mean, there are certain.
No, it was a
Yeah.
swing state.
Yeah.
I mean, voted Obama, right?
Mhm.
Twice.
All
Yeah.
right,
Okay.
so. See you
Thanks,
guys.
Arnie. Thanks for all that work.
All right, and I guess we're gonna stop recording and I'll convert the recording to a YouTube video and send it
Mhm.
out. Okay, thank
And
you.
Okay.
please delete the last 5 minutes too.
Oh yeah, sorry.
Don't want that to go
All
online.
right,
That's right.
idea.
I'm getting paranoid too, Roy.
bye.
All right, take care.
All right.
Bye.
So